Welcome everyone. My name is Tanya Barham. I'm the CEO and founder of Community Energy Labs. I'm here with my colleagues, Kurt Johnson, Amanda Begley from the Climate Center. Many of you are familiar with the Climate Center's work to advance the decarbonization in the great state of California, and a lot of their foundational work in moving forward the community choice aggregation model in the state and in many of your communities. I'm also joined by Kate, who will introduce herself briefly, but Kate has been really key in helping organize communities around concepts of decarbonization, grid connectivity, and innovating the electrical infrastructure of our communities. Many of you know me from previously having been the Director of Operations and Product Management at Portland Energy Conservation, Inc. So PECI was the nation's first energy conservation program. It was just like today's climate action plans. It was the nation's first conservation plan established in the 70s. PECI then became a nonprofit that was working on energy conservation until the 2014, when we pivoted to focus entirely on how to help communities that had signed 100% renewable energy pledges decarbonize, whether or not their utility was ready to move ahead. And so with that in mind, all three of our organizations, and now I spun off PECI's IP into Community Energy Labs. So when I talk about CEL and PECI, it's similar work. So the three of us have been working with NGOs now since 2016, and what we've seen some patterns emerge. So as we've been working in clean tech, climate justice, community nonprofits, we've presented about community energy resilience planning throughout the state of California and nationally over the past couple of years. But like you, we're starting to feel like now is the time for action. We want to engage a wider variety of communities, not just the largest, not just the wealthiest, though they have to be part of the conversation too, and are often, at the forefront of these movements. But we know that there are many people in your communities that want to create a community of practice. And so we're here today with our three motivations. One is to gather feedback and support from you that will move community energy resilience planning from a concept that we're giving unidirectional lectures about to an accessible practice that will lead to action and results for every community in the state, not just the largest, not just the wealthiest, not just the most motivated, but for everyone to have tangible results when it comes to climate and energy resilience planning. And we want to chart that path forward that leads to getting your communities the support they need. And that leads me to the second and third purpose for this webinar. We want to organize California communities to alert you to and formally list your government and stakeholders as being in support of legislation on statewide technical and capacity building for community energy resilience. And Kurt is going to tell you about the initiatives that are going on at the state policy level to assist communities in raising this issue to the top of the stack legislatively. We also want to let funders, both private and public, know that there is a real need among local governments for technical assistance and capacity building when it comes to implementing community energy resilience planning in every California community. And that providing this capacity in a manner that is accessible to communities of all sizes is important for an equitable and climate safe California. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kate, who will introduce herself briefly and then give you a little bit of background on why now is the right time for action on energy and community resilience.
Thanks, Tanya. I am Kate Ringness, Managing Director of SmartBlock Communities, and I'm also a Senior Advisor on the Oakland EcoBlock project. We focus on helping communities create eco makeovers of their communities by looking not just at the electrical system, but also the water system, energy efficiency, and taking all of the conservation efforts together and approaching them from a systemic level. So, but why are we all doing this right now? Why are we all here? We're here because California is suffering from the worsening impacts of climate change. We've got wildfires, heat waves, public safety power shutoffs, blackouts, brownouts, the list just keeps going on and on and on. But really, the challenge here is our energy costs are continuing to rise. So we've got all of these problems, and yet we're still paying more for all of this. So this all disproportionately affects low-income populations and communities of color. It's also affecting those of us who are trying to work from home, and we lose our power when we're trying to connect to the internet. We need to really act right now to plan and implement resilience measures to mitigate these negative impacts. So the problem is, though, is that we have cities are facing budget shortfalls, particularly due to pandemic-induced economic recession. The funding landscape is becoming more constrained because of all these competing needs. This type of planning takes a lot of expertise, and community leaders just don't have the expertise needed to make the plans that are required to promote this sustainability actions. And planning processes are cumbersome and time-consuming. But the opportunity here is really amazing. So right now we have public support for climate action continues to grow. We don't have very many climate deniers out there right now. And particularly as communities are directly experiencing adverse impacts of climate change and power shutoffs. We also have an advantage right now where President-elect Biden's transition team is actively searching for ways to reduce carbon emissions by providing resources to cities and states. They know that the action needs to happen at lower levels than the federal government, and they know that cities and states are the way to do this. So there will be resources coming soon from the very, very top. As we said before, planning processes are time and resource consuming. So a practical toolkit and use of tiger teams can create efficiencies that enable rapid deployment of solutions. A practical toolkit that fully integrates community engagement, project concept development, long-term capacity building in terms of staff, policy development, funding, financing, and more will streamline the process and make it more efficient. And the great thing is some groups are already making considerable progress to advance community energy resilient solutions. Our team can compile and translate case studies and best practices that other communities have used, and we can apply those on a broader scale for everyone to take advantage of. And we can do this particularly for use in underserved and under-resourced communities. Now I'm going to pass it over to Tanya to talk a little bit more in detail about the toolkit.
All right, so what specifically are we talking about in terms of a shared resource? This is sort of the condensed version of a presentation that many of you I know in the audience have probably already seen through either Local Government Commission or the Climate Center. Decarbonization and resilience are deeply intertwined, though, with local infrastructure. And this is the part where we're thinking not just of our own communities, but our adjacent communities, because while we have to solve that problem at the local level, the impacts of decarbonization, lack of decarbonization, and climate impacts are global. So decarbonization and resilience are deeply intertwined with local infrastructure, the motivations and goals of community members, but they also require this wide-ranging technical skills in a number of disciplines related to data science, project finance, engineering, community engagement and marketing, distributed system planning processes for utilities, and as Kate mentioned, and all of you know too well, not every community is going to have access to these types of resources full-time, nor would it make financial sense for them to have such dedicated resources full-time because they're expensive. But if trying to sort through the complexity of the local players involved in resilience planning gives you a headache, then how the heck are we supposed to manage that complexity at a scale where every community in the state and actually the country can engage? Well, here's what usually happens. In the traditional process, you'll have utilities coming with their distribution planning procedures. You'll have communities coming with ideas that they have for how to rapidly decarbonize. And each party comes in with a solution fully baked. It creates slowdowns, disagreement, and dry holes in terms of developing shovel-ready resilience projects. I'm going to give you something that I call the Mayor Bob example. Many communities that we'd worked with at PECI came in and said, we want to do a microgrid for resilience and clean energy, and we want it in Mayor Bob's yard. He's willing to host the microgrid. Well, the utility transmission and distribution planners and engineers are looking at the community and they're like, this is stupid. There's no capacity problem in Mayor Bob's yard. This is going to be multiple times more expensive, and you don't really have a reliability problem because you're in a city and we're doing distribution automation. The problem here is that typically the utilities have all of the data, all of the topology data, all of the energy data, all of the distribution engineers and planners. So that's not data that the community had access to. And then the second problem is that the community wants to move more quickly, and they actually have access to understanding what matters to our community. Where are there site hosts who are willing to host this? We control local zoning laws, franchise rights, et cetera. So bringing those two assets together is actually an important part of a process that you're seeing up here on the screen, which helps co-create community resilience plans with the skills, abilities, and knowledge of each of the stakeholder groups necessary to achieve true, affordable, and equitable community resilience. So between 2016 and 2019, PECI, a nonprofit that I was the CEO of at the time, COO of, worked with 94 communities nationwide, transmission and distribution planners from utilities, project finance professionals, engineers, policymakers to iterate a systematic model for planning and collaboration that joins distribution system planning with market transformation, education, outreach, environmental justice, and engagement, so that we can leverage the existing assets of communities. We can engage the appropriate stakeholders to move things faster, more quickly. We can align the objectives of both so that we produce projects that are far more feasible financially, technically, and from a community acceptance perspective. And we can select the best options. We called this method the path to energy independence, and it won a National Visionary of the Year award through the Smart Electric Power Alliance for the innovative way that prior to solutioning, prior to saying, let's put a microgrid in Mayor Bob's yard, the parties form a shared understanding of what is possible technically and financially, and how to prioritize what is possible to meet the broader goals and overcome the inevitable obstacles that such complex sets of projects can entail. The first step is a multidisciplinary stakeholder group and approach that links the goals of communities with the technical skills and of distribution system planning processes for all kinds of utilities. In states like California, I know that your local governments, many of them, especially those with CCAs, are actively engaging state policymakers and utility regulators about the need for cross-cutting distribution system analysis and collaboration when it comes to local infrastructure investment in energy resilience. Here's an example, though, for those of you who are not aware of this need, about why local infrastructure planning processes are so key to affordable energy resilience project rollout, and why there's such a strong need to align those and co-create those in a methodical way up front. In this example, what you're seeing here on the top left, you're seeing what is a typical electrical utility distribution system planning process. You're also seeing gas utility and community planning models featured here. So up at the top, you've got building stock, energy efficiency, and carbon models. And then down here, gas main replacement costs. So let's talk a little bit about an example in a community in Massachusetts of how all of these things had to come together to find the most optimal set of projects at the most affordable cost, the most equitably, well into the future. The Boston University heat study showed that nearly 1/3 of the natural gas pipes under Massachusetts streets were aging and leak prone. At the current rates, the cost for replacing all of these leak prone pipes would have been $9.5 billion. The Department of Public Utilities approved that ratepayers should bear that cost. Now, keep in mind that work would happen over 17 years, and those new gas pipes would last for 60 years, long past when the community planned to move to electricity. In the meantime, gas main replacement creates work for pipe fitters and other labor unions that contribute to local economic activity. So any opposition to laying gas pipe is going to run into opposition to bans on gas infrastructure. So some advocates suggested, why don't we use aging gas infrastructure to meet increasing needs for telecommunications at the grid edge? You've probably seen the Blue Lake Rancheria microgrid presentation, or some of you may have. One of the things that they say that's very true is if you're in the microgrid business, you're in the telecommunications business. While that sounds like a great idea, gas, electricity, and telecom are all separate regulated monopolies with their own planning processes and cost structures. So critical to all of these are local franchise rights, land use regulations, zoning, interconnection queues, etc., permitting, inspection, much of which is managed by community planners and retail utilities. So how do we bring this bowl of spaghetti together in a way that can really impactfully create shovel-ready portfolios that are specific to the local needs and infrastructure, but that are less likely to result in years of wasted effort, years of wasting public interest, enthusiasm, and instead directs all of those wonderful assets and intentions into projects that actually have a higher likelihood of being deployed. The first implementation that we did of the tools and processes that I described to you in the previous two slides were a team that worked hand in hand with community and industry partners in the rural Washington town of Tenino. Let me give you a little bit of background on Tenino. Nearly a third of the town's 700 households report income under $25,000. We worked with partners to deploy energy planning tools and methodologies to provide technical support, securing nearly $7 million in an extremely unique community and utility-owned business model for a microgrid, along with partnerships and grants from the Washington Department of Commerce and others. The project is under contract and will result in a microgrid with solar PV, grid-scale lithium-ion battery storage, and it'll back up the local high school, which is an emergency sheltering site. It also integrates vocational and technical training for displaced coal workers who work at the local coal plant that will be shutting down in 2025. And it serves as a potential test site for research and development of behind-the-meter virtual power plant technology. It should be noted that there was something for everyone here. The City Council included vocal climate deniers. However, the stakeholder alignment process, along with the technical community asset mapping process, moving toward a set of projects that everyone could agree on, resulted in addressing the needs of climate deniers for vocational education and resilience. So it wasn't focused necessarily on climate in their case, but it was a methodological process around energy infrastructure that resulted in projects that everyone could agree on and support. Community-led resilience planning is an attractive means to productively engage consumers, technologists, utilities, regulators, environmental justice advocates, and others at a scale where both technical constraints and local goals can be more readily understood and addressed more manageably than they could at the scale of an entire utility territory or an entire utility distribution system planning process. This process has the capacity to better leverage the strengths of utility and system planners and to align those with the needs, motivation, capital, and objectives of community stakeholders, project developers, and other groups. In places like the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, achieving real-time operation of a 100% renewable grid for their island for multiple days in a row involved engaging community members to help them identify, finance, locate, and operate distributed energy resources as part of a diverse portfolio of flexible grid assets. As more California communities adopt all electric reach codes, having a method to align and engage public-private partnerships as part of our community energy resilience solutions is going to be key. We'd like to create a documented, living toolkit and community of practice among all of you in California communities that leverages best practices, creates a shared resource that is accessible to all, even if you're the size of Tenino, and even if you have climate deniers in industry sitting at the table. We all need to be at the table. As Amanda noted before, we're going to be having an interactive portion of today's presentation where we want to get your take and some discussion on the ideas that I've just presented for a California toolkit and community of practice concept. I am going to turn it over, before we have that discussion though, I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to say what the Climate Center is doing at the state level to try and advance awareness among state legislatures about the need for these types of resources for all California communities.
Thanks, Tanya. So there are principal sort of objectives here of getting local governments, those of you on the call, to essentially raise your hand and be on record as being interested in this. And so what we're going to be asking you to do at the end and in the poll is to sort of express your interest in potentially taking advantage of a toolkit were something like this available. And we're looking for federal support, we're looking for grant maker support and state government support. And then specifically, we're going to be working on legislation to make this kind of process that Tanya described sort of standard operating procedure for local governments across California. Next slide. So the process that Tanya described of community energy resilience planning would become state policy if legislation that we've been working on with Senator Dodd's office is enacted. It was introduced in February of 2020 as SB 1314, the Community Energy Resilience Act, and Senator Dodd has agreed to reintroduce it again this year in 2021. Essentially, it basically makes it a matter of state policy that creating energy resilient communities is a state objective, and that needs to be sort of first and foremost in communities of concern, communities sort of most impacted by air pollution and power and public safety power shutoffs. You know, all of these issues that Tanya described are really jurisdictional and best handled by local community-based organizations and local governments. What's happening now in California, it's all top-down driven. In response to PSPS events, there's a microgrid proceeding before the PUC. The IOUs are kind of coming in with a top-down proposal in many cases. It's central, a lot of diesel gensets, and it's failing to take into account the interests of local governments so that the decisions about, you know, what gets built and where and whose loads are prioritized, that should be driven from the bottom up and through a process which is led by local governments as opposed to what's happening currently, which is top down. And so enacting legislation to declare a state policy that this is how we need to move forward in California, it's kind of a foundational piece. We have other legislative initiatives as part of our Community Energy Resilience Initiative. I could talk about, we don't have time, it's details at theclimatecenter.org/microgrids, and we're going to be rolling out additional details about our overall legislative agenda in the coming weeks. But the foundational piece of all this is this concept of community energy resilience planning, which would become a matter of state policy and a technical assistance program supported by state government if this legislation moves forward in 2021. I'm going to come back around at the end and talk about next steps, but at this point, Tanya's going to move into the interactive part of the conversation.
Fantastic. There are also some great questions going on right now in the Q&A. I did say I'd like to answer one of those live, but what I think I'd like to do is, if everyone's comfortable with it, this is where we really want you to interact either with the panelists and other attendees or first and foremost with the poll. So Amanda is going to post a link in the chat. Everybody, please go down to your chat right now and click that link. That link is going to take you to a poll. There is a ulterior motive for using this poll, and we might as well just tell you what it is, which is we want you to take 10 to 15 minutes and put your feedback, your very significant, very candid feedback about a statewide shared resource to provide technical assistance, capacity, and a toolkit to communities all around the state so that we can tailor this both to your needs and make sure that we're able to show support to funders who could potentially fund this and seed the funding for it, that there is a real need and we know specifically what those needs are and what your feedback is. And we'd like your support and organization in that effort. So the first thing we'd like you to do is head to the poll right now. Tell us a little bit about when, and remember, I understand, obviously, we understand that cities have a lot of needs. There are needs for housing affordability. There are needs for more economic development, tax revenues, given what's going on with COVID. How do we address all of these things? Specifically, however, we're looking for the intersection of those types of needs, affordability, quality of life, health and wellness, with energy infrastructure, decarbonization, and resilience, because that's the area where we feel that right now there is an opportunity for us to seek funding and resources and direct that back to communities. So right now, everyone, please head to the poll and begin answering the questions. You might want to mute me or turn your speakers off if our talking behind the scenes is going to distract you from being able to answer that appropriately. So as everyone is communicating, so again, go to your chat window down below in the chat. We have the link to the form and begin filling that out. I don't see any responses in the form right now, and we are going to want to look at how you're responding at the end of this. We're going to give you 10 to 15 minutes to fill out that poll and think about what are your community's top priorities with regards to resilience, energy, and having a shared resource. What obstacles do you face in trying to implement the kinds of energy infrastructure innovation that you'd like to implement? Nick brought up a great one in the Q&A, and I'll get to that in a sec. Where specifically does your community need the most support? If there's a limited number of funder dollars, is there an area where all of your communities out there can agree that it would be really important to get human resources to coordinate with the local distribution utility? Do you need planners? Do you need outreach? Do you need GIS specialists? Where's the area that we can support you the most? And then on the comments, share anything that you believe relates to that we should be, again, the audience is communicating to funders and legislators about the needs of communities and how to address those. Also, it's very important for you to indicate if you want us to try and if you would implement a community energy resilience toolkit in your community with your either your sustainability leaders, your council, your NGOs that are working in your community. Indicate yes, and we'll be sure to get back to you with follow-up, including authoring letters of support for funding and engaging you in driving this legislation forward. So everybody, please go to the link in the chat below and take 10 minutes to start filling this out. I see we've got 4 people, but there are 66 of you on the call. So if my talking and our answering questions while you all are answering the quizzes is an issue, just turn your speakers off, mute your speakers so you don't have to hear us talking, and really focus on the survey. We definitely want to hear your thoughts, your unvarnished thoughts. So now I'd like to take just a few minutes while those responses are trickling in. We've got 5 responses, and I know there are 60 of you on the call, so please get in there and fill out the survey. To take a little bit of time to address some of the Q&A while others are filling out the survey.
And I should add, Tanya, people can probably do the survey even faster than 10 minutes. You can just kind of click, 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 click. And the most important questions would be, as you said, if there were a toolkit, as Tanya described, available, would your community be interested in sort of utilizing it? And that's going to become the basis for follow-up, which we'll talk about at the end.
Oh, great. So I'd like to address, we'll ask Nick Peterson. Nick, thank you for your question. Nick said, IOUs are profit-driven. They're not motivated to work towards the energy independence that benefits local communities, which are interested in moving toward local sustainable solar energy. They work behind the scenes to undercut progress on this, like gaming the energy content label to look more sustainable than local CCAs. What do you suggest is the best approach to convince utilities that moving out of the production market and just making a better resilient distribution grid is where they belong? I'll open that up to my panelists. I have a view on that from the work that we had been doing with this process, but I'd love to hear Kurt or Kate, any of your thoughts on Nick's question.
Tanya, why don't you go ahead and answer first, and then we'll go after you.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Kurt. All I know is that when we worked with communities, so we were working with communities in the state of Oregon, in Washington and California, what we saw is when we started with the really engaged core stakeholder groups in the community first, so typically this is going to be NGOs, CCAs, often there are going to be community members that may have the level of engineering expertise or they're former utility workers. And then whoever the local government representative is from the utility, we would start the methodology, the stakeholder methodology, working with those groups to just ask very neutral questions. Where are there opportunities for us to meet our goals, and what are those goals? And we would state them really plainly. And we'd say to the utilities, like, everybody needs to put on their table what their real objectives are. And if theirs is profit maximizing, well, what becomes very attractive then to a utility is being able to keep their customers. And so if the way that they are rolling out these energy programs isn't linking up with how quickly individual communities want to decarbonize, what we found was the communities would start to articulate this. The data would prove that there were projects that made sense, that aligned all of the stakeholders' needs. You can put it in a matrix. There were projects that could also be financially feasible and technically feasible. And once the community said, look, this is a project that we know we can fund with USDA REAP funds, if it was a small rural community, with CEC funds, with federal funds, with our own funds, and there's a real reason for it and a need for it in our community, really it was sort of like, all right, utilities, now it's time to get in front of the parade. And, you know, in Tenino, that's to a large degree what happened. I mean, also some of these utilities are quite large and they just don't move very fast. But once that they saw that the community was very organized, they had a very good portfolio of projects, they had a lot of sustained interest in the process and good participation, they were eager to contribute $3 million to the project and use that as match to get the Washington Department of Commerce to finance the other $3 million. And that community engagement continues to be high. And now they're looking to fund other projects with either private partners, grant partners, or folks other than the utility. So Nick, I think, I don't want to say if you build it, they will come, but if you get organized and if you get smart, it becomes really hard for a utility to say, if our customer is going to take load off the grid with or without us, then it might as well be with us. And we found that it was a lot easier to get them to collaborate. Any other thoughts on that?
I just want to merge that question with the related question asked by Martha about how does the process that you articulated, you know, interact with what CCAs are doing in California. I think it's fair to say that the CCAs, because of their governance structure, they're necessarily you know, designed to be very accountable to local government needs. And so the CCAs are on the forefront of this kind of effort currently in California. And we can sort of go into details about what's happening with some of the CCAs in California, but we don't have a lot of time here. The reason that SB 1314, the Community Energy Resilience Act, specifically prioritizes you know, low-income, disadvantaged communities, communities of color, is because if you look at a map of where we currently have CCAs, they're typically not located in areas that suffer most from power outages and air pollution. So I guess in the world of very limited state resources, which is where we are now, you know, perhaps the CCAs are going to continue to do this using their existing resources, and the new state program could systematically support these other communities in California that don't currently have a CCA. I should also, you know, make clear that there are related existing programs. Strategic Growth Council has been called the Transformative Climate Communities Program, which is related, which is sort of directionally moving in a similar direction. It's just not happening yet at the scale and speed which needs to happen, you know, commensurate with the need to enhance resilience with clean energy. Kate, did you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, just addressing the utilities issue. The conversation we've had with utilities, you know, I think it's important to start early. Talking to the right people at the utility is also important. This is a scary new territory for an IOU, and helping them understand that you're all willing to work together to make sure you're protecting the safety of the grid, the safety of their line workers. The tariff discussion is something that kind of gets folks get wrapped around the axle on. And there's a lot of movement right now to sort out sort of microgrid tariffs and the value that microgrids and community resilience efforts bring to the overall grid. And I think as we see in the next year, we're going to see a shift in the ability to work with the IOUs because of the work we're doing on tariffs, as well as what the CPUC has in front of them in the proceedings right now.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that. So just to kind of create a framework to how to think about these things. So what needs to happen first is that there needs to be local government driven community energy resilience planning to sort of figure out, okay, what needs to be built to serve whom and how. And then that's a starting point. And then in order for these things to actually get built, the necessary financial incentives have to be sort of created. The state's, you know, in a rough patch financially at the moment. So that's where the PUC and the action and the proceeding called SB 1339 was legislation passed in 2018, authored by Senator Stern. It specifically directed the PUC to develop tariffs to commercialize microgrids. That has very clearly not happened, notwithstanding the statutory deadline of coming up with those tariffs by December of 2020. we could sort of go down in the weeds on that. So one of the other components of legislation that the Climate Center is working on for 2021 is coming up with tariffs which clearly incentivize private sector-led development and community-led development built upon a financial model so that the incentives are there to make things happen. And there would need to be to address the disadvantaged community gap I talked about, a specific overlay such that the private sector would be incented to do this kind of development first and foremost in disadvantaged communities in California.
Thanks to the panelists. We have a lot of good questions coming in. I'd like to address some of the, also I want to take folks back to the chat below. We have 22 responses to the survey. There are 62 of you on the call. So I think my math is okay. We've got 40 more that need to do the survey, and we'd love to hear from you. You do not have to put your name on the survey. You can leave it anonymous. We'd love for your support, but all feedback is welcome. So the next question is by Robert Perry. He said, can the panelists speak to the multiplier benefits offered by citing advanced distributed energy technologies at schools, both in supporting vital emergency services while also offering a community outreach portal and an age-appropriate curricula that will help develop a local skilled workforce? From this perspective, shouldn't all schools be considered critical facilities for initial development in all communities? So do my co-panelists want to address that?
I can start on that. Robert, yes, to all of it. I think you actually spoke to a lot of the multiplier benefits already in terms of education and resiliency, but also things to think about are saving school districts money. You know, a lot of the state of Virginia has been really great about putting solar panels on schools, and they're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in their school budget from not paying for electricity. So yes, 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 and yes, get the schools involved. It's fantastic.
Just to further clarify, the idea of the Community Energy Resilience Act is that, the decisions about what are the highest priority critical facilities would be made by local governments first. So they would sort of look at their asset base, they'd look at the existing distribution utility infrastructure and come up with a plan. In many cases, that might yield, a decision that a school should become a community resilience center. APEN has a whole community resilience hub concept that they're developing. The idea being that we need these sort of community centers that are, disaster recovery and resilience centers available for all kinds of events, not only power outages, but earthquake and all the other reasons why there might need to be a community center. And implicit in that is the idea, not only would they be, energy resilient with local sort of renewable resources and storage in most cases, but also have, other services and benefits to the community as described in Robert's note. Again, though, the idea is that the local governments would decide what their priorities and where they want to focus resources. Tanya, do you want to sum up the poll results at this point?
Well, I was going to say we're still waiting for a few responses, and I did want to. There's so many good questions. We probably won't have a chance to answer them all, but I'm hoping that if those of you go down to the survey, click on the form, fill it out, and put your contact information. Like we said, our goal is to create a community of practice, and I think explicitly engaging not only CCAs. Several questions came up around financing these types of projects, as well as, again, things like, should schools be resilience centers? I think part of the complexity of these projects is that there are emerging private models to finance these, microgrid as a service, energy as a service, but typically what those financing organizations require is very large portfolios of projects. And so, what project finance and energy currently finances is very large generation projects, or in the case of some RFPs, being able to put batteries all over the place. But when you're surgically going into communities and you need to package together a bunch of distributed energy resource projects, it's difficult for the funders and for the project developers to make this, to get their piece of the pie. out of it. So it really behooves community to have a process that leads them down a pathway where they're finding projects that are technically and financially feasible, as well as appealing and likely to be supported by their community in terms of fast tracking any zoning, any permitting, any other rules that might typically hang this up, or to think critically about how to speed that process. So one thing that I would say is when we look at financing, there are these evolving financing, project finance models that are looking for big chunks of capacity. But when you're talking about, let's say 25 megawatts as a minimum project size, that could be very difficult for a small community to do unless they were joined with other communities through, for example, a CCA. And I do know that Silicon Valley Clean Energy does in fact have a grant program and technical assistance for its community members to apply for assistance in identifying projects like this. However, Silicon Valley Clean Energy also has, 13 communities, and they were able to bank up those funds in order to subsidize that through their revenues. Like Kurt said, not every community has that early planning capacity in terms of money, in terms of technical expertise, etc. So that's what we are really trying to address is, yes, there are finance mechanisms, but those organizations need somebody else to qualify these projects technically and in terms of local feasibility. And that requires gathering a lot of little small projects together at a size that many communities cannot afford. I was also excited to see that RCOG, West Riverside Council of Governments, had an RFP out a while ago to look at trying to aggregate that planning function for a number of their communities. But again, it's timely, it's not necessarily cost effective. And if we had a resource statewide that could be shared amongst a number of communities, we feel that that would be the best, or our experience tells us that that would be the very best way to try to deploy this type of expertise and arrive at the right solutions for the communities, but also solutions that they can embrace that are financeable. So we have 26 responses in the survey right now. I will tell you a little bit about what we're seeing here. And again, if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us directly after the webinar. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we have in the responses so far. So 26 responses. The first thing that we're seeing is when we ask, what are your community members and leadership's top priorities with regards to both energy and resilience, the number one priority that was the highest is transportation decarbonization. However, I will say that there were 20 people said that was their highest priority, but pretty much every option that we had was selected. There is not a single one that wasn't a high priority for at least half of the applicants. But the next thing that folks put was moving quickly toward decarbonization goals for their local community, as well as economic development. So those were the three highest high priority areas, as well as purchasing green energy. So as you can see, communities are trying to move quickly to decarbonization by electrifying transportation, electrification, purchasing green energy, and making those meet in the middle. So finding those qualified projects that can help decarbonize. What obstacles do you face to implementing your top priority? The very largest obstacle was a lack of financing for projects. And again, from the private finance side, at least, though we talked about there may be public opportunities for financing, from the private side, there's a lack of financeable projects at a large enough scale for private capital to fund. So here we have, we need someone to fill that gap, to be able to give communities the capacity to create portfolios of financeable projects. That was by far the biggest obstacle. 21 of the respondents said that that was the top priority, followed only by staff capacity in terms of hours. Just not enough hours in a day for existing staff to be able to lead these initiatives, to move these different stakeholders through the sort of technical and stakeholder decision-making process. So having additional staff capacity, and some of you may have found out about this webinar through the local government commission. Their Civic Spark program is part of how we envision the capacity once we have the toolkit, having additional capacity by Civic Spark fellows implementing on behalf of smaller communities and even larger communities that may not have those hours of staff capacity to be able to implement this type of a process. One of the last areas of obstacles is an overall budget for the community. They feel that it's too small to make a meaningful impact. And this again is why we believe that aggregating all of these communities into a community of practice is our way to get the attention of financiers, regulators, and funders to make this happen as a shared resource. Where does your community need the most support? The 4 areas that need the most support is financial modeling, understanding how to model these projects and to look at the payback. And we saw that a lot in our Q&A as well. Project assessment and feasibility, which includes both financial, technical, and transmission and distribution engineering. There are a number of interconnection queues. There are a number of things there. So project assessment and feasibility was the second to financial modeling, but both very close. Financing, how to put together a financeable portfolio of projects, and then technical, planning, engineering, data, GIS, and consultant or fellow capacity. Those were the main issues. The rest were sort of like, we're doing okay for project and portfolio management, facilitation, and community engagement were A-okay. If you have not filled out that survey yet, we definitely want you to do so. We want to hear what you think. You do not have to put your name in there. We'd like your feedback. I will now turn this presentation over to my co-presenter, Kurt Johnson, to wrap it up.
Thanks, Tanya. And I was glad to see that the highest priority seemed to be about transportation, as people are aware. That's the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California and nationally. And there is a great opportunity there. And related to a question that Nick had asked about how these things integrate, a couple of weeks ago, Governor Newsom announced a zero emission vehicle executive order that makes it illegal to sell internal combustion engine vehicles in California by 2035. We're hoping that will be sort of codified in legislation and that goal will be moved up. But even if you look at the existing trends of EV adoption across the state, I think, what is it? I just saw that Tesla is trading at a PE ratio that's something, it's crazy. It's like 500. It's insane. So a lot of interest in this. So the relevant result is going to be a massive increase in mobile storage EVs. And so the nice thing is that can be harnessed if we put in place appropriate policies in California as a resilient grid asset. So sort of put bluntly, if we have all these electric cars who are being charged during the day with excess solar and that can sort of plug into the grid during evening peak, 4 to 9 p.m. and export and get rid of our evening ramp, that's a huge added resilience asset to California, as well as a huge climate solution. So we need the policies in place in the state and even within local governments to make that happen. But that is the vision, I think, that we can get everybody around to support simultaneously decarbonization as well as enhanced resilience. In terms of next steps, so again, the purpose of this webinar is to identify organizations interested in participating in some kind of a process. I'm, for example, this afternoon working on a grant for trying to get money to support this in low-income communities across the state. Having a list of organizations that have effectively raised their hand and said, I would take advantage of this if it were available, will be directly helpful to us in getting funding. And then, as I said, one of the options that we're pursuing to make this happen is passage of this bill, the Community Energy Resilience Act in 2021. So we will be coming back to you after the bill is introduced and say, here's a specific bill text. We're looking for local governments to be able to sign on to say they support this, so that Senator Dodd, the bill's author, can say to his colleagues in Sacramento, there's a wide sort of variety of people interested in making this happen. And perhaps we can get it over the line and sign into law in 2021. So those are the two principal purposes of people sort of self-identifying as being interested. So those are next steps. An additional sort of next step that Tanya talked about is, this is brand new as an area, this whole idea of sort of bottom-up community energy resilience planning. We've had 100 years of sort of top down, the utilities are going to handle it for us, and that's proven not to work very well. And so there's a fabulous opportunity to create a whole new community of practice of local government officials and others who want to make this vision a reality. And so we're trying to foment the creation of that community. And so we'll continue to send out information from the Climate Center, about related case studies, about what's happening federally that's related, what's happening with state policy that's related, and who are some of the local governments that are stepping out in local entities. As Tanya talked about, Silicon Valley Clean Energy is doing some of this already. So hopefully we can coalesce around this future vision and build a community of people, potentially holding regular webinars, who are all trying to work on this exciting new world together. So with that, we have our contact information here at the end. And are there additional questions or items in the chat that we should talk about, Tanya?
Great, Kurt. Let me see. For some reason, my Q&A box went away, but here we go. We have so many questions and answers. I would encourage all of you to just note the presenter's contact information and feel free to contact the presenters directly. I also want to encourage you all that to not only fill out the form, but send it to other communities that might not have been able to make the call. Kurt, what is the core of SB 1314? Is it still just a $75 million grant program, or help? David asks for you to help him understand the core of where you're moving with SB 1314.
It first and foremost establishes as a matter of state policy that it's a priority to conduct this community energy resilience planning process. And then it sets forth a creation of technical assistance that would be made available to local governments to do this. Essentially, one of the components would be funding the toolkit that we all want to sort of have exist, either funded by the state or by a grant, or potentially even from the feds later on. And then finally, as funding becomes available, there's various options on the table. There might be a climate bond in 2022. We'll see if the state's fiscal position improves, and there can be sort of potentially general funds. It would be a funding source for local governments, first prioritizing disadvantaged communities to complete this local planning process, utilizing the toolkit that has been created. So hopefully that summarizes it. We'll have additional information up on our website as the bill is finalized and posted. Again, it will be posted once introduced. It's theclimatecenter.org/microgrids.
I just want to, we've got, trying to look at someone who has not had a question asked yet. It looks like most of these folks have asked and had at least one answered, but Marna Schwartz does ask, how would a shared toolkit work alongside engagement with the CPUC? Would the community of practice still work to engage the CPUC?
I think I can answer that question. So in the microgrid proceeding, the so-called track 1 decision that was issued in June of this year created an obligation that the IOUs sort of staff up and systematically expand the available information that they're providing to local governments. We were happy to see that at the Climate Center because that was a direct reflection of comments we had filed in the proceeding earlier on. And so the June decision in that proceeding obligated the IOUs to make available the existing distribution system and load data available to local governments so that they could do this. So I guess the answer is that the PUC has at some level already mandated that the investor-owned utilities provide the needed data for this to go forward. And another sort of twist on the question is this is all an evolving area right now. The microgrid proceeding is underway. We've been waiting for a so-called track 2 decision for months. That may come out this week. They would specify how this is going to roll out. The initial proposal had called for 15, if you can believe it. There's tens of thousands of critical facilities in California. The initial proposal called for creating 15 microgrids, which is ridiculously small relative to the need. And so, the Climate Center and others had sort of proposed radically expanding the amount of resources that are going to local governments to have a lot more of that support going to, rather than a very small number of people. This is happening in real time before the PUC. So the answer is that question is being sort of adjudicated through the existing PUC process. And we'll have a lot more information about where it stands at the moment once that proposed decision comes out, which is expected, any moment.
I just wanted to make one comment there too. I've seen now several presentations by CPUC Commissioner Gutierrez, Guzman Aceves, who has expressed repeatedly a strong desire for local communities to engage with the CPUC. And I think this is one of the issues. When I was at the Local Government Commission conference, many of the communities spoke up to her and she said, we want you there. We want you there and we want to hear your voices. But what happens is that same lack of capacity. I mean, you could spend your whole life in CPUC proceedings. Becoming an intervener can be very time consuming. It can be difficult to track and to follow all the dockets. Unlike, again, utilities that have whole groups of lawyers on staff that can attend every single docket repeatedly, it's very difficult to find capacity to engage with the CPUC. So one of the things that we envision is to build that capacity. Obviously, those communities that have a CCA will have a lobbying or legislative body through CalCCA that advocates on their behalf. But when we're looking at advocating for the real diversity of communities in the state around this planning function, the CPUC does want to hear from you, but it can be very difficult to engage when it requires so much of your time. And many of you are already volunteers, basically. You might be a volunteer mayor or council person. You are not being paid to do this. So you've got enough on your plate. And we want your engagement. We want a way to sort of bring everyone together and to represent some of that work, obviously in parallel with, in partnership with, in any way that's going to make what needs to happen, which is, resilient, vibrant communities with clean air. So many good questions. Really appreciated the engagement of everybody on the call. Again, thank you to those of you who took the time to respond to the survey. We encourage you to share that with other community leaders that you think would like to engage in pushing this community of practice forward. Henceforth, you'll receive most of the communication about this initiative through the Climate Center, as they're the hub that's organizing all of the partners, all of the interested communities, and other NGOs, nonprofits, and stakeholders like Kate and myself in this initiative. So Kurt and Amanda, I will let you send us off.
Thanks, everybody. Amanda, any closing thoughts?
I do just want to give a shout out to Local Government Commission. I know we said it in the chat, but I just wanted to say it out loud, and they helped us with the promotion of this. So thank you so much to them and Julia Kim. And thank you all for attending and participating with us. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a lovely rest of your day.